It all started on a quiet Saturday morning. My wife and I were working around our property, just enjoying the peace that comes with country living. We had just finished repainting the barn doors, something we'd been meaning to do for months. That's when Karen from the HOA showed up again. Now, we've had our fair share of run-ins with her over the smallest things, like leaving a ladder out for too long or parking too close to the mailbox. But this time, she took it to a whole new level. She marched up, demanding that we open our barn so she could inspect it for unauthorized storage. My wife calmly told her no, reminding her that it was private property and had nothing to do with HOA regulations. But Karen wasn't having it. She stormed off, threatening to call the cops. We honestly didn't think she'd go through with it. But 20 minutes later, 2 patrol cars pulled up right in front of our driveway. I could see Karen smirking from across the street, arms folded like she had just caught some major criminals. The officers got out and asked to search the barn. My wife stood her ground and refused. And that's when things started to get interesting, because she mentioned someone Karen had no idea about. Her father. My wife's father just happens to be a retired FBI agent. Not only that, he still consults on active investigations. And the best part? He was inside our house at that very moment, sipping coffee and reading the paper. What happened next completely flipped the situation on its head. Karen thought she was calling the shots, but she had no clue what she'd just walked into. Just say things didn't go the way she planned by the end of it. She wasn't smirking anymore as the officers stood in front of us. Trying to stay professional, my wife calmly asked if they had a warrant. They admitted they didn't, but said they were responding to a suspicious structure complaint made by a neighbor. That neighbor, of course, being Karen. She was now pacing near the end of her driveway, pretending to water her flowers, but kept glancing over like she couldn't wait to see us in cuffs or something. The funny thing is, there's nothing illegal or suspicious about our barn. It's just a regular structure we use for storing tools, gardening equipment, and sometimes leftover supplies for my woodworking hobby. My wife stepped inside for a moment, and when she returned, her dad was right behind her. Now, her father is a quiet guy, the kind of man who doesn't raise his voice but commands attention when he speaks. He walked right up to the officers, introduced himself, and asked for their badge numbers in the calmest tone I've ever heard. One of the officers recognized his name immediately. I saw the mood shift almost instantly. The officers straightened up and glanced at each other like they suddenly realized this wasn't some petty HOA drama. They were now face to face with someone who probably knew the law better than they did. Meanwhile, Karen noticed him too. Her face went pale. You could tell she hadn't expected this to turn into anything more than a power trip. She started walking back toward her house, but it was too late. My father-in-law wasn't just some retiree. He'd worked cases involving everything from fraud to national security. And if there's one thing he doesn't tolerate, it's people using the law as a weapon to harass others. And right there on our front lawn, the tables quietly began to turn, but not in the way Karen could have ever expected. The officers, now noticeably cautious, started choosing their words carefully. One of them explained again that they were simply responding to a complaint. But my father-in-law interrupted him politely but firmly. He asked if the complaint included any specific criminal allegation. The officer hesitated. "No, sir. It was more of a community concern," he admitted. That's when my father-in-law asked if they were aware of HOA boundaries versus actual legal jurisdiction. The officers looked uncomfortable. You could feel the air change. Karen must have realized things were slipping out of her control because she walked back over, arms crossed, trying to act like she still had authority. She claimed she had every right to report us because she suspected the barn might be hiding code violations. She even pulled out a printout of HOA rules, waving it like it was a court order. My wife calmly told her that HOA regulations didn't give her the right to enter private structures or involve law enforcement without proof of wrongdoing. But Karen wasn't backing down. She insisted she'd seen unusual deliveries going into the barn. That's when it clicked. She must have seen me unloading lumber and paint a few days earlier. In her mind, that turned into some secret project that needed to be shut down at the same time. A few of our neighbors had started gathering nearby, watching the whole thing unfold. Some of them looked concerned, others just curious. One neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, leaned over to whisper that Karen had also been snooping around their property the week before, snapping pictures of people's fences and yard decorations. It became clear this wasn't just about our barn. Karen had been going on some kind of self-appointed compliance patrol around the neighborhood, acting like the HOA sheriff. But while Karen kept talking, my father-in-law quietly stepped aside and made a phone call. We didn't know who he called, but whatever it was, he didn't look happy. That moment marked the beginning of something much bigger than just a neighborhood squabble. My father-in-law ended that quiet phone call with a nod and a short, serious thank you. Then he slipped his phone back into his pocket and looked toward the officers. "You might want to stay a bit longer," he said, in that calm, steady tone that always feels more like a warning than a suggestion. The officers exchanged a look, and one of them stepped back to radio something in. Karen, meanwhile, was still going off ranting about neighborhood standards and how some people think they're above the rules just because they have bigger properties or older last names. But no one was really listening to her anymore. More neighbors had gathered across the street now, and a few began whispering about Karen's past complaints. Someone even mentioned that she tried to fine a family for putting up Halloween lights too early last fall. Her pattern was becoming clearer with every whispered story. This wasn't just about our barn, and it never had been. This was about control. Inside the barn, all we had were tools, wood, some leftover paint cans, and my dog's spare crate. But to Karen, it was some kind of mystery bunker. She'd let her imagination spiral, and now she was desperate to prove something, anything would justify her behavior. That's when an unmarked black SUV pulled up to the edge of our driveway. It didn't have lights, didn't make any noise. Two men in dark suits stepped out. They didn't look at Karen. They walked straight to my father-in-law and shook his hand, speaking quietly. Karen tried to butt in, demanding to know who they were, but they ignored her completely. The entire street seemed to go silent for a second. The tension hit its peak. Everyone stood still. Karen's face had gone completely stiff, like she wasn't sure if she should double down or run. My wife and I stood by the barn, holding our ground, while the men turned toward the officers and said 6 simple words: "We need to see the report." The moment those words left the man's mouth, "We need to see the report," Karen looked like she'd swallowed a lemon whole. She quickly stepped in again, trying to explain her version of events, saying she was only doing her duty. As an HOA board member, one of the suited men turned his eyes toward her, calm but unreadable, and simply asked, "Ma'am, did you file any written documentation or just make a verbal complaint?" That stopped her mid-sentence. She stammered something about a phone call, then mentioned a few emails to the HOA list, but it was clear she had nothing formal. The officers looked uneasy again. That's when one of the men pulled out a small black folder and handed it to my father-in-law. He flipped it open and gave a tight nod. My wife shot him a glance, silently asking if everything was okay, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked over at me and quietly said, "This just got bigger than the barn." I didn't understand at first, but then he leaned in and whispered, "There's an ongoing investigation involving misuse of local authorities, OAs included, and Karen just stepped into the middle of it." Turns out, she wasn't just bothering us. There had been anonymous complaints from other residents in the past. few months, people afraid to speak out because they didn't want trouble. Karen had apparently been collecting personal info, entering yards without permission, and even submitting fake violations to pressure certain families. She'd overstepped, and now she'd drawn federal attention. The agents weren't just there for support. They had been watching the HOA's actions for weeks, maybe longer. Our barn incident, it was the trigger they needed to step in. What Karen thought was just another neighborhood power move had actually opened a door she didn't even know existed. And while she was still talking, still trying to control the narrative, one of the men quietly began walking toward her mailbox. The suited man stopped at Karen's mailbox and motioned for one of the officers to join him. My father-in-law walked over too, quietly explaining something the rest of us couldn't hear. Karen followed, her voice now high-pitched and defensive, claiming her mailbox was federal property and that no one had the right to touch it. But the agent calmly pointed to something taped inside an open envelope, barely visible, stuck behind the door flap. He slipped on gloves, removed it carefully, and held it up. Inside were several folded HOA letters, but not the kind anyone had received officially. These were copies of violation notices, doctored and unsigned, targeting different neighbors. What stood out most were the addresses, not just ours, but others on the block, including Mrs. Jenkins and the family with the Halloween decorations. All had been altered to look like formal HOA warnings, even though no such actions had ever been approved by the board. Karen's face froze. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. One of the officers asked her straight up, "Did you create these notices?" She denied it, fast. Too fast. But the agent with the folder already had a printout. "These were sent from a personal email tied to your property's IP address," he said. "We've been tracking activity for weeks. Just needed proof it wasn't a fluke." My wife stepped closer to me, speechless. What began as a petty barn complaint had unraveled into something much bigger, a pattern of harassment that had now turned into a legal matter. As Karen was quietly asked to step aside and answer some questions, most of the neighbors slowly began to leave, shaking their heads. The tension finally cracked, but just as things seemed to settle, the second agent walked over to my father-in-law and handed him a slip of paper. He glanced at it and frowned. "This isn't just about her," he said under his breath. "Apparently, someone higher up in the HOA had been helping her all along." And that's when we realized the real story was only beginning. In the weeks that followed, everything slowly came to light. Karen had been working with one of the senior members of the HOA board, someone with access to official templates and resident information. Together, they had been creating fake violation notices, pressuring certain neighbors to comply with made-up rules or even sell their homes. Their goal? To reshape the neighborhood into something that fit their idea of perfect. But thanks to that one phone call and my father-in-law's quiet involvement, it all unraveled. Formal complaints were filed. The HOA held an emergency meeting, this time with real transparency. Karen and the board member both resigned under pressure, and an internal review was launched to keep future abuse in check. The neighborhood finally had a voice again. People started talking more openly, sharing stories they'd been too nervous to tell before. Turns out, we weren't the only ones Karen had targeted. She'd just made the mistake of choosing the wrong barn on the wrong day. As for us, we kept to our usual routine. We repainted the barn doors again, this time with bright red trim, just to make a point. My wife's father went back home, proud but quiet, never one to take credit. And the officers? They stopped by a few days later just to check in, and even joked about asking him to give a seminar on neighborhood law. Looking back, it's wild how a simple knock on a barn door led to exposing something so much bigger. The lesson? You never really know who you're messing with, and sometimes the quietest people in the room carry the most weight. Respect goes a long way. And in a world full of Karens, it helps to have an FBI father-in-law and a strong cup of coffee nearby.